Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the panel on oceans here at the Nicholas Launch. I'm Mike Orbach, the director of the Duke University Marine Laboratory and professor of marine affairs and policy here in the Nicholas School. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists and then give just a brief introduction to the topic here, and then ask the panelists to respond to two different questions that I posed to them, each in order. The first one is, what are the greatest challenges and issues facing us with ocean issues today? And then second are, what are the pathways for progress on those issues? And I will ask each of them to talk about the first question first and go through the panel, and then answer the second question, and then we'll open the floor up for discussion. And we intend this to be a panel with lots of discussion. The panelists are Professor Daniel Pauly, who's the director of the Fisheries Center at the University of British Columbia, well known for his Fishing Down the Food Web and other articles, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Paul Parker, who's actually a graduate of our CEM program here and is the executive director of the Commercial Hook Fishermen's Association out of Chatham, Massachusetts, an actual fisherman in the room, and a very strong advocate for sustainable fisheries. And Professor Susan Lozier, who's a professor of physical oceanography here at Duke University in the Nicholas School. So we have a great range of backgrounds and expertise and current situations, I guess I would say, on the panel here as well. I'd like to start and set the stage just with a couple of comments about the recent history of U.S. ocean policy. And I'm going to talk just for a couple minutes about U.S. ocean policy, although clearly this panel is intended to be broadly international in any of the comments or discussions that we have about issues with the ocean. Back in 1969, the Our Nation in the Sea report from the original Stratton Commission set in motion a lot of marine policy activity in the United States. It happened starting in about the 1970s with the Clean Water Act, 1972, Coastal Management Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, all in 1972. The Fishery Conservation Management Act comes along in 1976, the OCS Land Act's amendments in 78, and of course the creation of NOAA, which occurred actually in 1970 at the beginning of these periods. So the ocean policy legislation in this country followed the general pattern that you heard Russell Train talking about this morning with respect to the environmental movement generally in the United States. It's interesting that we've had basically no major new legislation on the ocean since that time. We've had amendments to some of these acts, but there was this huge explosion in the 1970s, and that included, of course, the initiation of the Law of the Sea negotiations that came up with the treaty in 1982. We have had comparable state-level activity in this country, and in fact, a lot of our coastal and ocean policy in this country relied for most of the last century on state-level activity. The states having the authority out to 3 miles, or except in the case of Texas and Florida, with somewhat extended jurisdiction. And there's been a great deal of state activity, especially in the area of fisheries, later on with oil and gas development, that has played into our national ocean policy in this country as well. And finally, international activity through the United Nations. We, of course, are a somewhat recalcitrant country in the Law of the Sea Treaty, not having signed that or ratified it yet. However, we have implemented essentially all of its provisions, the last one being the signing on to the International Seabed Authority, which, even though we have not officially ratified that document, we have in fact implemented virtually all of its provisions. We recently had 2 different ocean commissions I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The Pew Oceans Commission, which began first, funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, and the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, which just came out with its report last year. I think many of you are familiar with those reports. They were surprising in that from 2 slightly differently configured groups, there came virtually identical recommendations as to what the problems and issues were with the ocean and some of the things that we ought to do to rectify them. The Bush administration has responded now with their U.S. Ocean Action Plan, addressing many, if not all, of the points in the fashion of this administration in that document. And just this week, they released, some of you may have seen this, their preferred version of the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Act, which also picks up many of the points that were in the Commission reports. There are various bills in Congress which are intended to implement some portion of the recommendations in these two reports, none completely comprehensive, and none having passed yet. The Ocean Commission recommendations generally, both commissions recommended a National Ocean Policy Act. There are various forms of that, again, in Congress. Both recommended the creation of a National Ocean Council, which, in fact, the Commission on Ocean Policy has now been created with Jim Connaughton, the CEQ director, as the head of that. There was proposals in different measures to reorganize federal ocean agencies. That has not been done, but is, again, in Congress in various forms. A recommendation to establish regional ocean councils, with the Pew Commission recommending very strongly that regional ocean councils be promoted comprehensively, created comprehensively. The U.S. Commission backing off a bit and saying perhaps we should have some pilot projects of that kind. A doubling of ocean science funding, specifically recommended very strongly in the U.S. Ocean Commission report. That is one of the elements that was not picked up in the U.S. Ocean Action Plan. Increase in coastal and ocean protections generally, and this comes in a wide variety of forms. The promotion of lifelong ocean education. There was a large section on ocean education in both plans. And then, especially in the U.S. Ocean Commission plan, the admonition to get back into a position of international leadership and initiative on oceans. So those are the things that these commission reports have recommended and are in various stages of being considered now. I think the bottom line is we really have the opportunity of at least a generation on coastal and ocean issues to make some progress both in the public and private sectors, and that's what we're going to ask the panels to address today. Just for your information, I'll leave these up here. There's the this is the website for the Pew Ocean Commission, the U.S. Ocean Commission, and I'm putting up our Marine Lab website because we have just created a new Center for Marine Conservation at Duke with Professor Larry Crowder as the director of that. That is intended to be a focal point for some of this discussion as well. So, with that as a general introduction, I would like each of the panelists to first give us some thoughts on the question of what are the major challenges and issues facing us with the ocean today. And we will go in order of their seating here on the panel, with Daniel first, and then Paul, and then Susan. Daniel?
So I have 5 points. Whoops. I have 5 points which I think are the biggest problems in oceans today, as far as fisheries is concerned. The world fisheries catch is stagnating. It is at best, and it's decreasing if you look at it in detail. We don't know exactly how big it is. The world fisheries catch is actually absurd, but recently people realized that they were not accounting for illegal catch, though illegally caught fish are equally dead. They were not accounting for the discarded fish, though these are also dead. So it's unclear whether we're catching 100 million or 120 million or even 150 million. But all indicates that the catch is declining. And that it has to do done through the 90s. We have not been aware of it because China was over-reporting to a staggering amount. And so the official source of catch statistics was misled. That is the FAO. Since we know that, we account for this and the world catch is declining. The fleet of the world are capable of catching the present catch about 3 to 4 times over. So we have staggering overcapacity, and about everything that our governments do is encouraging them to grow. That is in the EU, that's also here. You will see all kind of subsidy going to people in Louisiana to buy new boats. And so in the tsunami affected zone, this is also something that is happening. It is growing, and this is the way our politicians deal with fisheries problem. The biomass of fish targeted by fisheries, traditionally targeted by fisheries, is 10 to 100 times smaller than before the onset of fisheries. That is come as a surprise, perhaps to some. that it can be so much. But actually, the fisheries have moved on to smaller fish. That's the fishing down effect. To smaller fish, to non-conventional fish. The target fish population, like cod or flounder or whatever, were good fish 100 years ago, 50 years ago, is now reduced to the extent that there is no more fishery on them. An increased fraction of the world forage fish, that is a small fish that marine mammals, seabirds, and lardfish need for food, are diverted to fish farming. That's also an important thing. It is so important that in some areas this is affecting marine mammals in big time. The best example is in the Mediterranean, where things like a common dolphin have become rare. And they have become rare because their food, that is anchovies and sardines, is not available. It's fed not anymore for doing frittura, the Italian dish of small fish that we all know, rather is fed to bluefin tuna, which are shipped and slaughtered the fish to Japan. It's also for used for salmon culture throughout the world. And my last point is, contrary to rice, of which only 5% is consumed outside of a radius of 100 kilometers where it is grown, 50% of the world fish is consumed outside of the continent where it was caught. And the transfer is from north to south, largely, north to south, from developing country to developed countries. And the biggest markets are the US, the EU, Japan, and increasingly China. Each of these points, fisheries catch the world, fleet capacity, the biomass of fish rapidly declining with an incredible loss of biodiversity, fraction of forage fish that is consumed by us rather than by the animals that we think we protect, and the massive exports. Each of these is a major problem. Jointly, they doom the fishery if not addressed.
Okay.
Good job. Good job. Daniel Pauly always does a great job capturing those problems that face our oceans. And I don't have very much at all to add to that list. What I do have is a story about what it looks like in my community, and then following through to the solution about how the way that this crisis is manifesting itself in our community gives rise to what I think is a pretty novel solution to a political dynamic that's causing failed policy development right now. I live in a small town. There's about 50 full-time fishing vessels traditionally in our town. And they range in size from about 30 feet to 42 feet long. And we catch cod. So basically, we go out on George's Bank and we catch cod. And it's been that way for as long as the oldest people on the docks can remember, and they tell me that the old people on the docks used to tell them that that's the way it was too. And we use hook and line to catch them, so it's long line fishery predominantly. Our fishery is dying, and it's not because of overregulation, it's because there's no fish left. Last year, 15% of our fleet went under, so they went out of business as a result of a lack of fish. And 15% of the school children in our, enrollment in our school district went down by 15% last year. The entire working class is basically migrating out of our community. And there are forces other than the collapse of the fishery that are contributing to that, like increasing real estate and whatnot. But the driving fact is, if there was any fish left to catch, these people have persevered for decades at this point and they would stay. But there's a sense of hopelessness. One of the things that was mentioned in the public relations talk earlier today is when we're talking to the public, there isn't any anger over this issue. And my community is absolutely chock full of anger. And the fishermen are angry, I'm angry. I feel like there has to be a better way to manage our resource than to lose this way of life and a culture in our community. And so that sort of takes us into a solution, which I can talk about in a minute.
Okay, Dr. Pauly. Susan.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the perspective that Dan and Paul bring, involved primarily in fisheries science and fisheries management. And what I want to do as an ocean scientist is sort of cast some of these issues in the broader scientific framework of the questions that we're asking about the ocean in this 21st century. And first I want to say that oceanography is still a fairly young field. Compared to perhaps forestry, atmospheric sciences, primarily because the ocean has been so inaccessible to us for so many decades. And there are many fundamental questions in ocean geology, ocean biology, chemistry, and physics that we don't know. But in the few minutes I have here, I want to focus on the issues that are surrounding what we want to know about the ocean as it responds to both natural and man-made climate change. And when I talk about that response, what I usually like to do is categorize it into the ocean having an active response and a passive response. And first, when we talk about the ocean passively responding to climate change, what we have to realize is that the ocean is a planetary fluid, and as such, it has a very large convective cycle, which means basically it overturns. That deep waters at high latitudes take the signals they've acquired at the surface and they move them down to the deep ocean. And in that respect, the ocean is a reservoir for climate signals. And in the past 5 years, we've had increasing evidence that the ocean has become an increasingly more so of a heat reservoir and a reservoir for anthropogenic carbon dioxide. So our deep oceans are warming as this conveyor belt that we talk about moves the warm waters down to the deep waters. And we now have techniques where we can separate the anthropogenic carbon dioxide from the natural carbon dioxide. And it's sobering to think that at 4,000 meters in our oceans, we now detect this anthropogenic carbon dioxide. So we're used to thinking of the oceans as sort of off limits. We may know that our coastal waters have felt our touch. We've been very aware for decades that the streams and the air we breathe have been affected by man. But to think that at 4,000 meters in the North Atlantic Ocean, we're seeing anthropogenic CO2 is indeed sobering. So what we're interested in is the continuing effectiveness of that reservoir for the ocean, and the change in heat and carbon dioxide and also fresh water impacts as well the issues that the gentleman on my left are talking about, because these temperature gradients, salinity gradients have a huge impact in establishing that physical environment that affects marine ecosystems all the way from primary productivity all the way up to fisheries. And another response for the ocean to this changing environment, which is a huge response, especially to our coastal communities around the globe, is sea level rise. For years we thought the main effect of sea level rise was due to the thermal expansion, but now we understand there's been a huge freshwater input. So exactly, to what extent the ocean can continue to warm and exhibit that thermal expansion, and to what extent it's going to take on these fresh waters, is going to have a lot to say about our projection of sea level rise. So we move also, though, to talk about the ocean and its active response. The question we're asking there is, well, how does the ocean circulation change in response to climate change? And then how does that ocean circulation change feed back to the ocean system? And the first thing that a scientist like me, a physical oceanographer, what comes to mind is, how do these changes in our heat and freshwater balance affect the overturning circulation? Because the overturning is what's responsible for the ocean being an effective reservoir. So if we didn't have the ocean as a reservoir for heat and carbon dioxide, we would have more heat and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. In fact, we know now that a third of the carbon dioxide that was put into the atmosphere is now contained in the ocean. So if we start changing the ocean properties at the surface, for instance, if we keep warming, what we will do is we will make those waters, we will essentially stratify the ocean waters, make them so stable because the surface waters are so warm that they will no longer overturn. Now, Hollywood notwithstanding, in terms of the movie about the day after tomorrow, they had the science right, but they had the time scale wrong. We're not going to stop the overturning in 24 hours. But abrupt climate change is a concern of oceanographers. In other words, how long can we continue to affect the properties of the surface ocean and still expect this overturning to continue? Another active response that we have all seen dramatically in the past week has been Hurricane Katrina. And there's been a recent study out, in fact it appeared in the journal Science on September 16th, that linked sea surface temperature anomalies, so rising sea surface temperatures in the tropical basins, to hurricane intensity. So that definitely is an active response of the ocean to a climate signal. So what I'm going to do is just, since I'm going to do a little boomerang here then, right? And we'll send back the policy solutions. How's that sound?
Sure. That's
Okay.
fine.
So In terms of what are the potential pathways for affecting changes in some of these issues, obviously I would, as a scientist, I would advocate that we increase science funding in these issues. But also I would advocate that we do a better job of educating the public, educating the legislators. So we feel as though we're doing a fairly good job of educating our students, but we need to do a better job of outreach and let them know about these issues that concern us all. And I view the Nicholas Institute as a place where scientists can have some voice in the policy making and those decisions. And right now, just the events of recent week have sort of keenly illustrated how there's really sort of two parallel, non-intersecting voices that we hear after the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina. So we hear scientists being interviewed on the radio, we see it in the press, and they're talking about how the intensity and the frequency of hurricanes is bound to increase as sea surface temperatures rise. We hear coastal geologists talk about the dangers of building on the shorelines. But at the same time, what we hear from the politicians, primarily the argument is, how are we going to fund the rebuilding? So what I'm hoping is that the Nicholas Institute affords the ocean scientists to address some of these major issues and then lend a voice to the policies and decisions that affect the oceans in the next century.
Okay. Before we go back on the second question, let me take moderator's prerogative here and add a couple of issues and then ask the audience if they would like to add any more issues here. I would add a couple. One tags on to one of the things that Susan said about rising sea level is the train wreck that we're clearly heading towards because of rising sea level and increasing development and movement of populations toward the coast. We have a rather uncontrolled movement of human populations toward the coast and a rather uncontrolled development of coastal infrastructure still in many of the very same areas where the sea level rise is going to affect us the most and the quickest. So the train wreck from rising sea level and coastal development is one I would like to add to our list here as well. A second is the clear degradation of coastal water quality and habitat that occurs in part from this development, but apart from things that happen miles away from the ocean, such as atmospheric deposition. We have more and more miles of closures of beaches to public swimming in this country every year. It's true that worldwide, that in developed areas, that's happening as well. So coastal habitat degradation and water quality degradation from anthropogenic sources, some of which again are atmospheric, is the second one I'd add to the list. The third is our lack of overall governance structure for the oceans generally. If you look at a map of the world oceans, you will see that even with the extended jurisdiction of countries, ocean-adjacent countries out to 200 miles, 60% of the world ocean, that is approximately 40% of the world's surface, is outside of any national jurisdiction and is essentially a minimally, if at all, regulated commons at this point. That is a huge, I call it the black hole of policy on the globe. We regulate the atmosphere, airline flights, radio wave transmissions much more closely than we regulate things that happen on the high seas or things that happen on the land. So our ocean at this point is the black hole of policy in this world. So that's the third point that I would add. Other points from the audience, people? Larry.
There's probably just one more major one, and that is invasive species. With globalization and increasing global shipping and so on, there's greater opportunities than ever before for species to arrive in new water bodies, disturbed water bodies in good condition to colonize. And I guess the key thing is that of all the factors that we've discussed, fisheries, climate, habitat degradation, pollution, invasive species, I can't think of a coastal zone that doesn't face most of those. So one of the things that you have to consider in terms of ocean policy is the interaction of those effects, where climate change may alter the invasibility of a coastal ecosystem. So one of the issues that we can fall into, and we fell into this morning with the discussions, was trying to isolate a factor like its environment, its economy. I think that's wrong think from the beginning. These factors are all interacting factors. And so we have to come up with a comprehensive approach for solutions. It's not just about resolving fisheries or about resolving climate change.
Okay. Other issues? Yeah, Bill?
I'm always interested to know what the state's role in solutions, however you might go at them.
Yeah, okay, we can certainly address that. I'm one who thinks that that's an underappreciated role, actually, in coastal issues. We can address that when we get back to it. Yes, ma'am?
This may not be, in some ways, a direct impact, but it has to do with pollution in the oceans and what it's doing to our food supply. And the issue that frequently now we're having to make decisions or risk benefits between eating fish, which may be highly contaminated, and the potential for adverse effects on health, which is basically a choice we shouldn't have to make. Some of that is being associated, I think with the crash of the natural fisheries, we're moving to farmed fish as the sort of the way of the future. The problem with the forage fish now being used to provide fish food, that forage fish is highly contaminated in many cases by pollutants. And if someone could at some point address some of the new approaches that are being used in aquaculture that may enable us to stabilize some of the fisheries and still provide adequate food supply.
Yeah, well, the aquaculture issue is one we will certainly come back to because it's a little unclear in many people's mind whether that's the loose solution or the problem in the long run. So we'll get back to that one. I would also say on the food security issue, it's very interesting for me to note that the Europeans and the Southeast Asians are clearly framing many fishery issues and what we would call conservation issues as food security issues. The United States, including the environmental community here, refuses to do that for reasons that sort of actually mystify me. And maybe we can get back to that a little bit later too. Other points? Yes.
There's some 50 million sport fishermen and sport fisherwomen in the United States, and I think it might be around 20 million that fish in the marine environment. Obviously, we have to examine the catch that the anglers are having, but also on the other hand, the monies that they use to purchase rods and reels and motorboat fuels. There's excise taxes on those that go into the Wallet Grove Fund, and that's used for habitat restoration and things. So I'd be interested in, while there's no representative of the sport fishing industry here, I'd be interested in your thoughts on expanding on the pluses and minuses of the nation's 50 million anglers.
Absolutely. It's interesting to note that the new Bush administration Magnuson reauthorization bill actually proposes creating a national saltwater fishing registry for recreational fishers in saltwater. Yeah.
Couple of large topics to add to possible long-term solutions, which has already been brought up. I'd like to put on the table. First one would be education, and not just at the university level, but starting far younger. And second would be the ethics in / religion as possible long-term solutions. I think that both of those should be brought into a discussion of solutions.
Okay. Other comments from the audience on the problems generally? Yeah, Pat, and then go ahead, Pat, and then here.
You already mentioned the fact that a large portion of the oceans is not managed, or it's not under jurisdiction. But to augment that, there's also quite a few transboundary issues in terms of management. This part of the solution is coming up with creative ways to deal with transboundary issues. It's a major piece on the table.
Okay. Yes.
I would take it all the way to the marketplace and changing people's views of alternative food sources to seafood, fish farming, and effective fish farming, environmentally effective fish farming. So educating through the consumer by changing consumer trends.
Okay, so the sustainable seafood movement, things like that. Yeah.
Not sustainable seafood, aqua farming, aquaculture, sea farming, whatever.
All right, let's go. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was going to say it's probably not of great import immediately, but if we are looking for the 21st century, I do think we have to keep ocean running.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is interesting for me to note that the only international, the only agreement that came out of the Law of the Sea Convention that reflects the concept of common heritage of humankind is in fact the International Seabed Authority, where there are, 7 active leases now, but no mining yet. Isn't that what it is? But at some point there will be. So absolutely. Okay, let's go back to the solutions part, what I call the so what part of this. Daniel knows what I call it this. So what? What are we going to do about all this?
I have the 5 kind of solution are specific to the 5 problems that I mentioned. I don't have agriculture as a solution because I view it as a problem, but I skipped it. I will have to get back to that. Okay. So the solution, subsidies are a major part of the reason for the overcapacity of the fleets worldwide. And subsidies also exist in the United States. Different countries subsidize differently. And it is possible, as you will notice in agriculture, to point out that the European Union is subsidizing and to completely overlook that the US subsidizes. This is because the nature of the subsidies is different. Altogether, it's estimated that 20% of the value of the fisheries is the average rate of subsidization. That's an estimate of the World Bank. There are other estimates, for example, the FAO, that estimate that is up to 100% of the value of the fisheries. And some countries or regions are so stuck in it that they actually are seeking their advice and their experience, or rather the intervention of the WTO. This is, the EU has asked the WTO to intervene in the area of subsidies, because subsidies are eating up the European Union and they're probably also eating up the United States. Obviously the agricultural subsidy are a bigger problem, but that's, if you can solve the subsidies in fishing, it will be a way toward agricultural subsidy. Subsidies enable fishing when otherwise fishing would be unrentable. It would be not profitable. So it is a major cause of overfishing. Marine protection. The marine protected area are viewed by many fishery scientists as the best way to create spaces where the biomass of the fish that have been so seriously depleted and where can be rebuilt and biodiversity maintained. At present, 1% of the world is under some marine protected area. This is much less than on land. On land, trees and forests are protected at about 10%, 10 to 20%. In the world, the 1%. And the marine protected area, cumulative area, increased by 5% per year. You can make the count that it's a doubling rate by 14 years. That means in 14 years we will have 2%, in 28 years 4%. We will never reach the goals that were at the present rate of declaring marine protected area. And 1/3 of all marine protected area is the Great Barrier Reef, incidentally. So marine protected area, there are lots of them. They are extremely hard to put up on the ground. Of these marine protected area, of this 1% of the world ocean, only 10% is protected effectively. That is, the fisheries, or whether sports, commercial, artisanal, exploit 99.9% of the ocean. And every time you try to get something under protection, they scream like a stuck pig. This is absurd. Two solutions that are much talked about is rights-based fishing and market-based campaign. Right-based fishing is the hobby horse of fisheries economists. And I'm biased, and I'm not going to try to give you a biased representation, but
There's one here, at least one.
Yeah. The perception is that if fishers could be guaranteed a fixed proportion of a quota, which could be determined by scientifically, then the fisheries problem would be alleviated. If this fisheries problem are seen as overcapacity, this is true. If the fisheries problem are seen as reduction of biomass, reduction of bottom cover, destruction of the habitat, this obviously is not true. This provides only part of the solution. Rights-based fishing, though, is problematic in my view at the conceptual level, because a right is something that the state has to enforce. And we have the right to life, for example, and if my right is denied to live, then the state has to intervene and punish those who have taken my life. Right-based fishing would have to be then enforced. I think that right-based fishing is a misnomer. Fishing is a privilege that is granted to a part of the population to access resources that belong to everybody. So people should pay. But an arrangement could be found that are very similar to rights-based fishing. For example, the right to fish could be auctioned. And with this, the security that is necessary to plan operation could be guaranteed as much as through so-called right-based fishing. Market-based campaign, the Marine Stewardship Council come to mind, and the advisory for people that Montreal Aquarium and another group make up has been proposed as a way of managing fisheries. The idea being that people avoid fisheries or consuming fish that is not sustainably certified, not certified as sustainable or sustainably fished. I think this is not going to affect more than a minority, and it's not really, even if it affected the majority of the consumers, it wouldn't matter, because it's not the majority and the average that determine the fate of a resource. It's the 2% that really want to eat the paw of the last panda, no grilled, or that the 2% that love to eat tuna steak. This is enough to doom all tuna. So you can have 90% of the population thinking that it is really bad to eat tuna for absolutely altruistic reason, and tuna will still be down, still go down the tube, because the 10% or 2% is sufficient. The example of the Chinese market for shark fins is a case in point. Most people throughout the world actually think that the sharks should be left alone and should have the fin on, but it is sufficient for a market, a specialized market, to emerge, and it is spreading in China for the tuna to be, for the sharks to be brought down. So changing the consumptive habit of people doesn't do it. Regulation at the end, or the state, in the sense of the government, has to be brought into the picture. So market-based solutions are probably right, but only for sensitization of the public, that they perhaps vote right, as opposed to try to manage the stock with the stomach. I think that it should be managed with the heads and perhaps with the heart, but not with the stomach. I think that the solution for most fisheries problem, and fisheries is not, as the colleague would say, a special issue, or what is he saying?
Special interest.
Special interest. It is actually the force that is modifying life on the ocean. And if it were not for global warming, I would say this is the only force capable of modifying life on the ocean. On shelves, and I don't want to contradict you, but it's true that 30% of the world is under EEZ. It's only and about 60% or 70% is outside. But actually, most of life is on shelves, and it's protected by the EEZ around the world. Now, these EEZs, they make up 90% of the catch that is in the world, and we on life on the shelves is heavily modified by fishing, to the same way that life on land is modified by farming. If we plow a forest under, or we eliminate a forest, we plow it under, and we farm, that's a massive modification. That's what we do when we trawl on a shelf. And actually most of the shelves, no, all of the shelves are all plowed under. So we don't have the equivalent of forest, of massive forest stand in the shelves of the world. And out of the shelves of the world come 90% of the catch. Okay, so I believe that the solution of this fisheries problem, which are problem of life in the ocean, not a peculiar problem of fishermen, but problem of life in the ocean, they will be resolved or they can be attacked by energy, by the concerns for energy. Big fleet will, and we will see that, we have begun to see that next year, but we will see that increasingly this year and the next years, are actually going to go bust because of fuel increase. Trawlers consume 10 tons, 20 tons per ton of fish they caught. The efficiency of trawlers diminishes very rapidly. This figure for trawlers I give for shrimp. For highly valuable fish, that's about the ratio. For bulk fish, it's perhaps 2 tons per ton of fish. For the average fish, that's 1.5 ton per ton of fish. And that is because the average, to compute it, you also take the fish that are very easy to catch in bulk, herring and sardine, for which you need 1 ton to catch 20 tons. So relationship is inverted. Fuel prices are affecting is 80% about the cost of toll operation, and hence, to the extent that fuel costs increase, if government can resist the call for increased fuel subsidy, they will go bust, and that will be seen very soon happening. The second thing is, and that is a secret because our paper on this appears in a few weeks in Ambio, they emit 1.5% of the world greenhouse. The fuel fleet, the fleet, or the fishing fleet of the world. You could say this is only 1.5%, but it's actually a large fraction, a large number, if you consider that 2/3 of it is unnecessary. And I cannot imagine a world, future world, in which everything is regulated in terms of energy and fisheries are not. So I think what will do the fisheries especially the industrial fisheries which are seen by many as efficient, which are not actually, will be fuel problem. The cost of fuel and the greenhouse gas control. And this will do the big fishery in. And at that point, fishers, smaller fishers like you perhaps, like sports fishers, like artisanal fisheries throughout the world, could reestablish themselves because they are actually useless energy. And we would be reset, we would be reset in the situation that we had before the onset of large-scale industrial monstrosity. We would be producing about the same amount of fish. We would be producing it using more people, passive gears, and using far less energy. That is if all goes well. If we don't lick the problem of global warming, we go to hell.
I have to say, Daniel, that do you know how much fuel a recreational king mackerel fisherman spends trying to catch one king mackerel?
He won't go.
It's way worse than all the ratios you're talking about.
He won't go when it's too expensive.
Oh yeah, these guys have lots of disposable income. Paul, go ahead.
Well, I tried to depress everybody from my little town, and that's what it's like there. And I think that sets the stage for the way I see the world in terms of U.S. fisheries policy. U.S. fisheries policy has basically been turned around by the Sustainable Fisheries Act in 1996 That law was passed at a time when you could go down to Washington, D.C. or up to D.C. from here with a pile of emails from a bunch of constituents in an NGO and change environmental policy. The tide has turned, and that messaging is not effective at this time. And I don't think it's ever going to be effective long term because political winds shift back and forth. And as long as the question is, do we protect these fish or do we protect these human beings, the answer is self-evident, which is to say that the fish will not prevail. Jobs win over fish every time, and short-term interests tend to prevail politically. And so when you take that in your head and you go back to a town like Chatham, Massachusetts, and you think about, how am I going to create political change? How am I going to take this Duke University degree and change the shape of the way policy is made in this country? You come to a few quick conclusions, which is, as a group of small businessmen, if you can change the question to, why is U.S. fisheries policy failing to protect my small businesses? You can go a lot further on Capitol Hill, and you can go further with both parties. Your issue becomes bipartisan and you gain strength. We've been very effective in our community at rallying around that message because it's an easy way to develop a core. And I heard that word used a couple of times today. If there's an environmental issue in front of us lacking a constituency base or core, I would say it's the marine environment. It's fractionated. You talked about recreational fishermen. You would think recreational fishermen would get along with some commercial fishermen, would get along with sailors and surfers and everything, but there's all these weird agendas. We need to get past that and just say, okay, what's good for these small businesses? And that message has resonated on Capitol Hill for us, and it's helped us to develop what I think is a pretty proactive agenda about how to change the way fisheries are managed. And without getting into the details of that, we're working on a program with Environmental Defense. It's a collaboration where we're working to bring fisheries management decisions from the federal level back to small places like Chatham and empower fishermen at the community level to act within scientifically defensible parameters. Scientists set a quota for us, and then we manage the fisheries ourselves. There's certainly problems with that, but some of the solutions that it does bring up is we act within what's scientifically defensible. The scientists give us a quota and we survive within it. We can deal with the capacity issue locally. We have too many boats in the near term. We also pay a tax, and from that tax we bear some of the federal costs of monitoring through monitoring our own catch rates. We also have a much higher level of accountability than the rest of the fleet. And I think it's models like this that are going to take decision-making and management of fisheries down to a more local level, using market-based solutions or privileges, and we can label them a lot of different ways. But if they work for small business and they work for small communities, I think that we can get a constituency behind them, and we're going to be able to change the way fisheries policy is made and implemented. As long as we continue to drive a message of, let's do this for the fish, I think we're going to continue to struggle. And so I think, in a nutshell, that's why a relatively small organization from Chatham ended up on a distinguished panel like this. And it's, it is a very small niche, but when I was listening to all the speakers today, there's a common theme through a lot of resource extraction issues. And I think that, we have to choose some alliances between environmental NGOs and the right characters. I operate in a fishery that's a disaster. And I think every day when you talk about, is it on the red list? Yeah, my fishery is always going to be on the red list. But we're a good actor in a bad play, and we do need to be rewarded for that. And we have worked on some marketing campaign work and whatnot to get value added to our product. So I think there are some solutions. I think that they're more political, perhaps, than philosophical. And I think that we have to be very pragmatic about how we make gains in the ocean arena in the next 3 to 5 years and long term after that.
Okay. Susan, do you want anything else as you said earlier?
I'll be very brief here, though I spoke a little bit about this before. But most of the issues that I were talking about have to do with the issue of global warming, and a lot of the policies there are being discussed in another panel. We've read about them for many years, and we move there from the local arena to clearly the national and international level. But many people believe that it might be too late to talk about prevention of global warming, that we're already seeing the manifestation of that, and that we need to be moving into adaptation. And so this reminds me to respond to something that Bill Ross asked a little earlier. And Bill Ross is our North Carolina Secretary for the Environment and Natural Resources. That's right. Mm-hmm. And he asked what we can do at the state level. And so one of the issues I mentioned was sea level rise. So if we think about adaptation, we might think about exactly how we manage the agricultural lands on our state's coast. If we think about saltwater intrusions, what should we be growing there that would be able to withstand this, and shoreline development as well. So it seems as though there's some role for the state, not only in playing as well in trying to prevent. In fact, the states have been playing an increasingly larger role in sort of battling the greenhouse gas emissions more so than the federal government has. But it also seems like the states have a large role to play when it talks about the coast and sort of mitigating some of these effects. The other thing I just wanted to reiterate was something that a former student here, Phyllis Dermer, brought up about stewardship. And there is a movement where people are starting to ask ethically, how should we be treating our environment, and the oceans are included in that as well. So to the extent that we can also frame this as an ethical question, I think that's going to help the issues that we're talking about here. That's going to help us quite a bit.
Okay. All right, we have maybe 5 minutes left. Tim told me to go ahead and take an hour here. We started about an hour ago, a little less than that. Questions or comments from the audience? Yes, sir.
Clearly, the Institute's about solutions. I think we all heard a lot about it this morning, and you guys spent a lot of time talking about it. It's very helpful. But why don't we, if you would just take a minute, and maybe we'll start with Paul, since he's sort of non-involved in this Institute, to say that if your answer has any implications. I just want each of you perhaps to take a minute and say, if I was running this institute, where would I like to set my brain to find the solutions? How would you go about it? Or we've talked about it generally, but if you were here at the institute.
Oh, you're giving him power. Watch out.
With this specific issue?
With any issue, exactly. You have a whole host of issues you can solve. In fact, the institute is broadly any environmental issue. And you want to change policy.
So
how do you make, what behaviors do you, or what actions do you have the institute take to affect policy?
In my role, I actually have a fair amount of exposure to Duke graduates from the MEM program. And I think that the overwhelming need that I see is more pragmatism in the political arena. I just think that it's a very simple dynamic. I've heard one other speaker talk about the way politics works today, very realistically, on another panel. And it's a lot about money. It's a lot about following the money. I think you can predict who's going to win and who's going to lose so often. And I think that it would be very beneficial for people to get a glimpse of that harsh, cold reality. And we might not like the results, but I think that every student should have a real good idea about how Capitol Hill works if they want to be in the policy arena.
I believe the low apple is subsidies. The United States might accept to not subsidize the building of boats, to not subsidize fuel for commercial fleet, and if this can be brought forward to the WTO by the EU and the United States, perhaps they can convince other countries to not do it, or do it only in their own waters.
Okay, but Daniel, customize that to what the Nicholas Institute could do. I mean, for example, you can put out science on the problem.
Get rid of subsidies in the Gulf of Mexico.
No, but what is the Nicholas? What do people associated with the Nicholas Institute do to accomplish what you're saying? Who actually does what on the ground?
I guess it's showing that the policy goal of putting the fishery on a sound ecological basis can be achieved by reduction of subsidies, or can be that the reduction of subsidies is the 500-pound gorilla, which prevents up to now a sound ocean policy, at least a fishery policy. And specifically aquaculture, the United States is going to involve itself in a massive subsidization scheme called development of EEZ aquaculture. There is no industry in this, and I don't understand where this legislation come from, except NOAA. There is no firm, no big firms involved in aquaculture in the open waters. There is no technology. The technological know-how is not here, is in Norway. And there is no technological know-how, no feasibility study, absolutely no reason to start aquaculture in the open waters. It can only be done with massive subsidies. In my demented mind, I'm thinking, what can it be? And the only thing I can find is that the oil industry is trying to get rid of its drill platform as an aquaculture platform. This is the only, because if they commission in that way, that costs them nothing. This is the only reason that I can see why this crazy scheme is going. There's not even a company behind that. So that is, this law is gone under the radar screen. It's pushed by NOAA, and you have absolutely no reason to have it. So that these are 2-3 policy issues that can be addressed.
Susan, do you?
Rather than issues, because I think there are a number of worthy issues, none worthier than the ocean, I might argue. But I think that it's, I think the most important thing the Nicholas Institute can do is present the science and policy of any environmental issue and present it in a nonpartisan way. So I think for too long, why our efforts on the environment have been stymied is because it's become a liberal cause. And so when we get into that political game, I think we're really having issues with that. And I think that's in large part why a lot of the effort is going on at state level and not at the federal level. So if we can present things, it doesn't mean we can't be advocates, but if we can present things in a nonpartisan way, I mean, I think that's more important than almost any issue we present, because we start building that basis, for how to communicate effectively about the environment and about our solutions.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end here, but let me just close by saying that I've always viewed the conservation as having 3 aspects. One is science and putting out information. That's what Daniel was speaking of. A second one is facilitating, getting people together to discuss issues so we understand them and commonly set common objectives. But the third one, and nothing gets changed without this third one, is the word that Susan just mentioned, and that's advocacy. And the Nicholas Institute is clearly going to do the first 2 of those things I mentioned, science and information and facilitation. The big question is to what extent we do the third one, and that is saying, here's what should happen. That, to me, is the big challenge for the Nicholas Institute. I'm happy to say, by the way, that the Marine program, through things like Larry's new Center for Marine Conservation, is in fact doing all 3 of these things already. So please help us continue that. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you very much.